The morning sun barely touched the edges of the city square when he arrived. His white cane made soft clicking sounds against the old cobblestones, a rhythm that had become as natural to him as breathing. The square was already filling up with people rushing to work, grabbing coffee, lost in their own worlds. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. It was hard to tell. His face carried the kind of tiredness that comes from years of struggle, but there was something else there too. Something that looked almost like determination. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind you see on someone who takes care of what little they have. In the center of the square sat an old public piano. The city had placed it there months ago as part of some community project. Most days it stood silent and ignored. Sometimes a tourist would tap out a clumsy tune. Other times kids would bang on the keys until their parents pulled them away. The piano had seen better days. Its black paint was chipped in places, and you could tell from across the square that some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. The blind man moved toward it with careful steps. His cane swept left and right, mapping the world he couldn't see. People barely glanced at him as they hurried past. This was the city, after all. Everyone had somewhere to be, something important to do. When he reached the piano bench, he paused. His free hand reached out, fingers searching for the edge of the seat. It took him a moment to orient himself to find the right position. He folded his cane carefully and set it against the side of the piano. Then he sat down slowly, like someone afraid of taking up too much space in the world. That's when the whispers started. A group of teenagers stood near the coffee cart, waiting for their orders. One of them noticed the blind man at the piano and nudged his friend. "Oh man, this is going to be interesting," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. His friends snickered. They pulled out their phones, but not to record something beautiful. They were ready to capture something to laugh at later, something to share with the caption, "You won't believe this." A woman in a business suit walked past, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. She glanced at the blind man and shook her head, a small smile of pity crossing her face. She'd seen plenty of street performers in her time. Most of them were just looking for handouts. She kept walking. Near the fountain, an older man who sold flowers every day shook his head. "That piano deserves better," he muttered to himself. He'd seen real musicians play that piano before. Students from the music academy sometimes stopped by. Those performances were worth stopping for. This was just going to be sad. The blind man sat perfectly still on the bench. His hands rested in his lap. He didn't move toward the keys. He just sat there breathing slowly, his face tilted slightly upward as if he could feel the morning sun on his skin. More people began to notice. A young mother with a stroller slowed down. Her little boy pointed at the man. "Mommy, why isn't he playing?" the child asked in that loud way kids do, not understanding that some questions are better asked quietly. The mother glanced over, saw the white cane, and quickly pushed the stroller forward. "Come on, sweetie. We're late." A delivery driver stopped his bike nearby, interested despite himself. He'd seen plenty of strange things in the square. This wouldn't be the strangest. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, deciding to spare a minute or two. Why not? It might be entertaining. The teenagers were getting impatient. "Is he going to play or just sit there?" One of them called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. His friends laughed harder. A few other people looked over now, drawn by the commotion. The blind man didn't react. If he heard them, and he must have, he gave no sign. His hands remained in his lap. His expression stayed calm, almost serene. It was as if he existed in a different world, one where the mockery couldn't touch him. A businessman checking his watch stopped for a second, curious about what everyone was looking at. He saw the blind man and immediately understood the situation. He'd worked hard his whole life to get where he was. He didn't have patience for people who couldn't pull their own weight. He shook his head and moved on, already thinking about his 9 o'clock meeting. The square was fully awake now. Coffee shops were buzzing. People crowded around the pastry stand. Pigeons pecked at crumbs on the ground. Car horns honked in the distance. Life in the city moved at its usual frantic pace. And in the middle of it all sat one man and one piano, both seemingly forgotten by time. "I bet he can't even find middle C," one of the teenagers said, and his friends burst out laughing. They were young, maybe 16 or 17, old enough to know better, but young enough not to care. They'd been raised in a world where everything was content. where other people's struggles were just entertainment for a screen. The flower seller couldn't help but watch now. Something about the scene bothered him. Maybe it was the way the blind man sat so still, so dignified even as people mocked him. Maybe it was the memory of his own hard times years ago, when people had looked at him the same way, with pity, with disgust, like he was less than human. A street musician who usually played guitar on the other side of the square had wandered over. She held her guitar case and watched with professional curiosity. She knew how hard it was to perform in public, how cruel audiences could be. She felt a twist of sympathy in her chest. Whatever was about to happen, she had a feeling it wasn't going to be pretty. The blind man finally moved. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hands from his lap. His fingers hovered over the keys, not touching them yet. He seemed to be feeling for something, sensing where everything was positioned. His head tilted slightly as if he was listening to a sound only he could hear. The crowd that had gathered, maybe 20 or 30 people now, watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some were already preparing to walk away. Others held their phones ready, waiting for the inevitable disaster. The teenagers grinned at each other, ready for the show. The morning air felt heavy somehow, charged with expectation and judgment. The old piano sat there with its chipped paint and sticky keys, waiting. The blind man's fingers finally touched the surface of the keys, resting there gently like greeting an old friend. No one in that square could have known what was about to happen. No one could have guessed that in the next few moments. Everything they thought they knew about music, about ability, about judging others, was going to be turned completely upside down. The city had laughed at the blind man. The city had dismissed him before he'd played a single note. The city had no idea what was coming. His fingers rested on the keys for what felt like forever. The square continued its morning chaos around him. People talked, laughed, shouted orders at coffee stands. Someone's phone rang with an annoying pop song ringtone. A bus hissed to a stop nearby, letting passengers off in a hurry. The blind man didn't seem to notice any of it. His fingers stayed perfectly still, barely touching the ivory keys. His eyes, though they couldn't see, were closed. His breathing was slow and steady, like someone preparing for something important. Something that mattered. "Is he broken or what?" one of the teenagers called out. More laughter followed. A few people who had stopped to watch started walking away. They had things to do. This was taking too long, and it was probably going to be a disappointment anyway. The delivery driver took another drag from his cigarette. He was starting to regret stopping. His next delivery was across town, and his boss got angry when he was late. Still, something kept him there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the hope that something interesting would happen in his boring day. Then, without warning, without announcement, the blind man pressed down on a single key. The note rang out across the square. Clear, pure, perfect. It wasn't loud, but somehow it cut through all the noise. It hung in the air for a moment, and a few people actually stopped talking mid-sentence. The sound had that quality, the kind that makes you pause without knowing why. The blind man played another note. Then another. Each one deliberate, careful, like he was testing the waters of a deep pool. His fingers moved slowly across the keys, finding their way through muscle memory and something else. Something deeper than sight. The melody started simple. So simple that the businessman who had stopped to listen for just a second thought he recognized it. Some old tune, maybe from a movie or a commercial. Nothing special. He was about to walk away when the blind man's left hand joined in. That changed everything. The left hand added depth, added richness. The simple melody suddenly had a foundation, a heartbeat. The notes started weaving together in ways that made the street musician with the guitar case lean forward. She knew music. She'd studied it for years. What she was hearing wasn't just playing. It was something more. The teenagers stopped laughing. Not because they wanted to, but because something in the music made the jokes feel wrong somehow. One of them lowered his phone without realizing it. The blind man's tempo picked up slightly. His fingers began moving faster, more confidently. The sticky keys that had bothered other players didn't seem to slow him down at all. He adjusted without thinking, working around the piano's flaws like he'd known them all his life. A woman who had been walking past with her headphones in actually stopped and pulled them out. The music from her phone couldn't compete with what was happening at the piano. She stood there, shopping bags in hand, completely still. The melody grew more complex, The blind man's right hand danced across the higher keys, while his left hand provided a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't just notes anymore. It was becoming something alive, something that breathed and moved and felt. The flower seller abandoned his stand completely. He walked closer to the piano, drawn by something he couldn't name. He'd heard music before, plenty of it, but this was different. This made his chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with his age or his health. More people were stopping now. Not because someone told them to, not because they had time, but because the music was reaching into the busy square and pulling them in one by one. A jogger slowed to a walk, then stopped completely. A couple having an argument fell silent, both turning toward the sound. The blind man's face had changed. The tired, guarded expression was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like peace. His head swayed slightly with the rhythm. His whole body seemed to be part of the music now, not just his hands. Every movement was fluid, natural, like water finding its way downhill. The teenage boy who had made the loudest jokes stood with his mouth slightly open. He'd stopped recording. His phone hung loose in his hand, forgotten. Something was happening inside him, something uncomfortable and new. It felt a little like shame, but also like wonder. The tempo shifted again, faster now, building towards something. The blind man's fingers flew across the keys with impossible precision. How could someone who couldn't see move with such accuracy? How could he hit every note perfectly, never once striking the wrong key? A young boy broke free from his father's hand and walked closer to the piano. His father reached for him, about to call him back, but then he heard it too. Really heard it. He let his son go and followed behind him, mesmerized. The square was changing. The noise level had dropped without anyone deciding to be quiet. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. People who had been rushing slowed down. It was as if the music was creating a bubble, a space where normal rules didn't apply, where time moved differently. The businesswoman in the suit who had walked past earlier came back. She didn't know why. She'd made it 3 blocks away before something made her turn around. Now she stood at the edge of the growing crowd, her briefcase at her feet, her important meeting completely forgotten. The music swelled. It filled the square like water filling a bowl, reaching every corner, touching every person. The melody was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. It carried emotion, loss, hope, pain, joy. All of it wrapped together in notes that seemed impossible to come from an old, beaten piano. An elderly woman with a cane of her own moved slowly through the crowd. People made way for her without being asked. She got as close to the piano as she could, her wrinkled hand covering her mouth. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't seem to notice. She just listened, her whole body swaying slightly. The street musician finally understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't just talent. This wasn't just practice or training. This was mastery. This was someone who had given their entire life to an instrument, who knew it so deeply that blindness was just a detail, not a disability. The blind man's fingers moved faster still. The music built and built, layer upon layer. Complex harmonies that shouldn't work somehow did. Rhythms that should clash instead supported each other. It was like watching a master painter work, except the canvas was sound and the paint was emotion. People were pulling out their phones now, but not to mock. To capture, to save, to share something extraordinary. A businessman filmed with shaking hands. A teenage girl held her phone up high, tears streaming down her face, not understanding why she was crying. The delivery driver had let his cigarette burn down to nothing. The ashes fell on his shoe and he didn't notice. He just stared at the blind man, his mouth hanging open slightly. In all his years delivering packages across the city, seeing 1,000 things, meeting 1,000 people, he'd never seen anything like this. The crowd was thick now. 30 people, 40, 50, more coming every second. They pressed closer, but carefully, respectfully. No one wanted to break the spell. No one wanted to disturb what was happening. And the blind man played on, lost in his music, his fingers telling a story his mouth never could. The city had laughed at him. The city had judged him. But now the city was listening, really listening, and beginning to understand that they had been wrong, so terribly, completely wrong. The music changed again. It softened, became gentler, like a storm passing and leaving behind only rain. The blind man's fingers slowed their frantic dance and found a new rhythm. Something sadder, something that felt like memory. A woman near the front of the crowd gasped softly. She pressed her hand to her chest right over her heart. The melody he was playing now reminded her of something. A lullaby her grandmother used to sing, maybe. Or the song that played at her wedding. She couldn't quite place it, but it didn't matter. The feeling was there, real and raw and undeniable. The crowd had grown massive now. Over 100 people stood in the square, all facing the same direction. Some had climbed onto benches to see better. Others held children on their shoulders. The coffee shops had emptied out. Even the baristas stood in their doorways, watching, listening, forgetting about the orders piling up on their counters. A police officer who patrolled the square every morning had stopped his rounds. He stood with his arms crossed, trying to maintain his professional composure, but his eyes were wet. He blinked rapidly, angry at himself for the emotion. He'd seen everything in this job. Break-ins, fights, accidents. He thought he was tough. But this music was breaking through walls he didn't even know he'd built. The teenager who had mocked the blind man earlier felt sick to his stomach. Not physically sick, but something worse. He watched the man play and felt the full weight of his earlier cruelty. His friends stood beside him, equally quiet now, equally ashamed. None of them could look at each other. They just watched and listened and wished they could take back their words. An old man in the crowd suddenly spoke, his voice shaky but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "I know him," he said. "I know who he is." People turned to look. The old man had tears running down his weathered face. His hands trembled as he pointed toward the piano. "That's him. That's really him. I thought he was dead." A woman next to him asked quietly, "Who? Who is he?" The old man swallowed hard. "Years ago, maybe 15 years, he was famous. I saw him perform at the concert hall across town. He played with orchestras, sold out shows. He was incredible then, but this..." He shook his head, unable to find the words. "This is something else entirely." The news spread through the crowd like ripples in water. Whispers passed from person to person. He was famous. He used to perform professionally. Something happened to him. The street musician who played guitar felt her knees go weak. She sat down right there on the cobblestones, her guitar case beside her. She'd been playing music for 10 years, thinking she understood what it meant to be a musician. Now she realized she'd barely scratched the surface. This man at the piano was showing her what music could really do, what it could really be. The blind man's playing grew more intense again. His whole upper body moved with the music now. His shoulders swayed. His head tilted back slightly, face toward the sky. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This wasn't just a performance. This was something being poured out, something that had been held inside for too long. A young woman in a nurse's uniform stood crying openly. She'd just finished a 12-hour night shift at the hospital. She'd watched 2 patients die that night. She was exhausted, heartbroken, questioning why she'd chosen this career. But this music was reminding her of something. Of beauty, of reasons to keep going, of why life mattered even when it was hard. The flower seller found himself thinking about his own life. He'd been selling flowers in this square for 30 years. Same spot, same flowers, same routine. He'd always thought of himself as simple, ordinary, maybe even boring. But listening to this music, he realized that everyone had depths. Everyone had stories, even him. Even the people who rushed past his stand every day without looking. More people kept arriving. Someone had posted a video online and it was already spreading. "You have to see this," the caption read. "Blind pianist in the square. Most beautiful thing I've ever heard." People were running from nearby offices, leaving their desks mid-task. Students were ditching classes. Shop owners were closing their doors and coming outside. The businessman who had dismissed the blind man earlier stood at the back of the crowd. He couldn't see the piano from where he was, but he could hear everything perfectly. He thought about the meeting he'd missed. It was important, a big deal. Thousands of dollars on the line. But standing here, listening to this, he realized he'd made the right choice. Some things mattered more than money. He was just beginning to remember what those things were. The blind man's left hand thundered across the lower keys, while his right hand created a melody that soared above it. The 2 parts shouldn't have worked together. They were too different, moving in opposite directions, but somehow they created perfect harmony, like 2 people who were complete opposites falling in love, like chaos and order existing in the same space. A teenage girl stood filming with her phone, but she was really watching through her screen. Her best friend had died 6 months ago in a car accident. She hadn't cried yet. Not really. Not the way she needed to. But something about this music was breaking through the wall she'd built. Her phone slipped in her hands as her shoulders began to shake. The tears finally came, and with them a strange kind of relief. The elderly woman with her own cane moved even closer. She was now just a few feet from the piano. She could see the blind man's face clearly. The concentration, the passion, the absolute surrender to the music. She whispered something under her breath, too quiet for anyone to hear. It might have been a prayer. It might have been a thank you. A delivery driver, not the same one from before, had pulled his truck over illegally and left it running in the middle of the street. He stood with the crowd, completely forgetting about his schedule, his job, his responsibilities. Other cars honked at his abandoned truck, but he didn't hear them. All he heard was the piano. The music told a story without words. It spoke of loss and grief, of years spent in darkness, both literal and metaphorical. It spoke of pain that felt like it would never end. But then slowly, carefully, it began to speak of something else, of hope creeping in like dawn, of finding purpose again, of learning that an ending could also be a beginning. A father held his young daughter on his shoulders. She was only 5 and didn't understand music theory or composition, but she understood feeling. "Daddy," she whispered, "why does the music make my tummy feel funny?" He squeezed her ankle gently. "Because it's real, sweetheart. Because it's true." The blind man's playing reached a crescendo. Every person in that square felt it building, felt something enormous about to break through. His fingers moved faster than seemed humanly possible. The old piano, with all its flaws and broken parts, sang like it had never sung before, like it was finally being played the way it was meant to be played. People held their breath. Some held hands with complete strangers. The whole square had become one organism, one beating heart, all connected by sound. And then, just when it seemed the music couldn't possibly build any higher, the blind man did something unexpected. He pulled back. The volume dropped. The tempo slowed. His fingers found a melody so simple, so pure, so heartbreakingly beautiful, that grown men sobbed. The city had laughed at the blind man. But the city wasn't laughing anymore. The city was learning what it meant to truly listen. The simple melody hung in the air like morning mist, delicate, fragile, beautiful in a way that made you afraid to breathe too hard, like you might break it. The blind man's fingers barely touched the keys now, coaxing out notes so soft that people in the back of the crowd had to strain to hear them. The old man who had recognized him was crying freely now, not caring who saw. He turned to the people around him, needing to tell someone, needing to share what he knew. "It was 11 years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There was an accident. A car crash. He was on his way to the biggest performance of his career. Symphony Hall sold out, 2,000 people waiting. The woman beside him listened, her hand covering her mouth. Others leaned in closer to hear. He never made it to that performance," the old man continued. "The crash was bad. Really bad. His wife was driving. She died instantly." His voice broke on that word, and he lost his sight, both eyes. The doctors said he'd never see again. A collective sound moved through the crowd. Not quite a gasp, not quite a moan. Something in between. The kind of sound people make when they hear about tragedy too big to fully comprehend. After that, he disappeared. The old man said, "No more concerts. No more recordings." People said he'd moved away. Some said he'd given up music completely. There were rumors he'd tried to... He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I thought I'd never hear him play again. I thought the world had lost him forever." The blind man continued playing, unaware of the conversation about him, or perhaps simply beyond caring. His face showed everything he'd been through. Every loss, every dark night, every moment he'd wanted to give up. But it also showed something else. Survival. Resilience. The stubborn human refusal to stay broken. A woman in the crowd, maybe in her 60s, suddenly pushed her way forward. People made room for her, seeing the urgency in her movements. She got close to the piano and stopped, her hand pressed to her heart. She stared at the blind man with recognition and disbelief. "It is you," she whispered, though several people nearby heard her. "Oh my God, it's really you," she was shaking. A younger man, probably her son, put his arm around her shoulders. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Do you know him?" "Know him?" She laughed and cried at the same time. "I'm the one who brought him here." The people around her fell silent, listening. Even the blind man's playing seemed to soften, as if making room for her story. "I volunteer at the community center on 5th Street," she explained, wiping her eyes. "About 3 years ago he showed up. Homeless, broken, he wouldn't talk to anyone. He'd just sit in the corner during meals, eating alone." She paused, watching the blind man play. "One day I saw him touching the old piano we have there. Just running his fingers over the keys, not pressing them. Just touching them like they were something precious he'd lost." Her son held her tighter as she continued. "I asked him if he played. He got angry. Said that part of his life was over. Said he'd never play again. But I saw something in his face. Pain, yes, but also longing. So I started asking him every single day, 'Will you play today?' Every day he said no. For months." The blind man's playing shifted again. A new melody emerged, one that sounded almost like a conversation. Questions and answers in musical form. "Then one day, about 2 years ago, I asked him like always, and he didn't say no," the woman said. "He didn't say yes either. He just stood up and walked to the piano. And he played one note, just one. Then he broke down crying. I'd never seen a man cry like that. Like everything inside him was pouring out. People in the crowd were crying now too. The story and the music wove together, each one making the other more powerful. After that, he started coming to the center every day to practice. Hours and hours. Learning to play again without sight. Retraining his hands, his memory, everything. It was like watching someone learn to walk after an accident. Painful, slow, but he kept going. The businesswoman who'd come back to listen felt something shift inside her chest. She spent her whole life climbing ladders, chasing promotions, measuring success in dollars and titles. But this man had lost everything, and somehow found the strength to rebuild himself from nothing. What was she doing with her life that mattered even half as much? The teenager who'd mocked the blind man earlier felt like he might throw up. He'd made fun of someone who'd survived hell and climbed back out. He'd laughed at courage and called it weakness. His hands were shaking as he lowered his phone completely, unable to even pretend to be filming anymore. Last week he told me he was ready, the volunteer said, ready to play in public again. I didn't know he meant today. I didn't know he'd come here to the square, where anyone could judge him. She looked around at the massive crowd. But look at all of you. Look at what he's done. The police officer who'd been trying not to cry gave up the fight. Tears rolled down his face as he stood in his uniform, supposed to be the strong one, the one in control. But there was no controlling this. No containing it. The music and the story together were too much for any wall to hold back. The blind man's playing grew stronger again. Not louder, but more confident. More assured. Like he was finally believing in himself again. His fingers found complicated patterns. Jazz-influenced chords that showed his training, his years of study. This wasn't just someone who'd learned piano. This was someone who'd devoted their entire existence to it. A news crew had arrived. A reporter stood at the edge of the crowd with her cameraman, both of them filming. But they weren't rushing forward to interview anyone. They weren't disrupting the moment. They just filmed silently, respectfully, understanding that they were witnessing something rare, something that didn't happen every day. The street musician with her guitar case sat on the ground and thought about giving up music altogether. Not because she felt defeated, but because she wasn't sure she could ever create something this honest, this real. Then she realized that wasn't the point. The point was to try, to keep trying even when it seemed impossible. That's what he'd done. That's what his music was saying to all of them. The father holding his daughter adjusted her weight on his shoulders. She was getting heavy, but he didn't care. He wanted her to remember this. Someday, when she was older, he'd tell her about the morning they watched a blind man play piano in the square. He'd tell her about courage, about second chances, about how the human spirit could survive anything if it had a reason to keep going. The blind man's playing built towards something. Everyone could feel it. The finale was coming, the moment that would bring it all together. The square held its breath, hundreds of hearts beating as one, all waiting for what would come next. And the music played on, telling the rest of the story that words never could. The final notes built like a wave gathering strength far out at sea. The blind man's entire body was part of the music now. His shoulders rose and fell with each phrase. His head tilted back, face turned upward as if he could see through the darkness to something beyond. Sweat ran down his temples, but his expression was peaceful, almost joyful. The crowd had swelled to nearly 300 people. The square was packed. People stood on benches, leaned out of windows, crowded onto balconies. Traffic had stopped completely. Cars sat abandoned in the street, their drivers standing among the crowd. No one honked. No one complained. The whole city had pressed pause. The music swirled and danced, building higher and higher. Every person in that square felt it rising inside their own chest. The blind man's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. How could someone play like this? How could someone who couldn't see navigate the keyboard with more accuracy than people who had perfect vision? But that was the point, wasn't it? He didn't need eyes. He had something deeper, something that went beyond the physical. His fingers knew these keys the way you know your own heartbeat. Instinctive, automatic, true. The melody reached its peak. A single high note rang out, clear and pure as crystal, holding in the air for what felt like forever. The blind man held it, sustained it, let it fill every corner of the square. Then slowly, gently, he began to bring it down. The music softened. The tempo slowed. His fingers found the same simple melody he'd started with, but now it meant something different. Now it wasn't asking a question. It was giving an answer. An answer about loss and love, about falling and getting back up, about finding light in the darkest places. The teenage boy who'd mocked him couldn't take it anymore. He pushed through the crowd toward the piano. His friends called after him, confused, but he didn't stop. He got to the front, close enough to see the blind man's face clearly, close enough to see the scars from the accident, faint but visible around his eyes and forehead. The boy stood there crying, waiting. When the blind man played the final chord and lifted his hands from the keys, when that last note faded into silence, the boy was the first to speak. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." The square was silent, completely, utterly silent. 300 people holding their breath. The blind man turned his head toward the voice. A small smile crossed his face. "You're one of the kids who was laughing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." The boy's face was red, tears streaming. "I was cruel. I was stupid. I'm sorry." The blind man's smile grew. "You know what I heard when you were laughing?" he asked. "I heard young people, alive, free, full of energy. Don't apologize for that. Just maybe next time, wait to see what happens before you judge." The boy nodded, unable to speak anymore. Other people in the crowd were crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. Then someone started clapping. Just one person. The elderly volunteer who'd helped him, who'd asked him every day to play, who'd never given up on him. Her applause rang out in the silent square. Another person joined. Then another. Then everyone at once. The sound was deafening. 300 people applauding, cheering, crying, celebrating. The noise echoed off the buildings surrounding the square. People whistled. They stomped their feet. They called out encouragement and praise. The blind man sat at the piano, that small smile still on his face, accepting their reaction with quiet grace. The teenagers who'd mocked him all came forward together. They stood in a line, all of them crying, all of them trying to apologize at once. The blind man reached out his hand and each one shook it, learning in that moment what real strength looked like. The businesswoman pushed through the crowd. She opened her purse and pulled out all the cash she had, several $100s. She placed it gently in the piano case, then stood there for a moment, her hand on the piano. "Thank you," she whispered. "You reminded me what matters." Others followed her lead. Money began filling the case. 20s, 50s, hundreds. The flower seller emptied his day's earnings into it. The police officer added his own money. People who'd stopped just to watch, who'd been about to judge and dismiss, now gave what they could. Not out of pity, out of respect. The street musician approached with her guitar case. She knelt beside the piano. "Could I ask you something?" she said. The blind man turned toward her voice. "Of course. How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you keep going after everything you've lost?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I realized something," he finally said. "When I lost my sight, I thought I'd lost music too. I thought you needed eyes to play piano, to perform, to create. But I was wrong. Music isn't in your eyes. It's not even in your hands. It's in here." He touched his chest. "And here." He touched his head. "And as long as those parts of me still worked, I could still play. I could still share this gift, maybe even better than before, because now I'm not distracted by what I can see. I only hear what matters." The young girl who'd lost her best friend pushed forward. "Can I hug you?" she asked, her voice small. The blind man opened his arms. She fell into them, sobbing, finally letting out everything she'd been holding inside for 6 months. He held her like a father would, like he understood exactly what she needed. "It's okay," he whispered. "Let it out. Music does that. It opens the doors we keep locked." The news reporter finally approached with her microphone. "Sir, the whole world is going to see this. Your performance is already going viral online. Millions of people are watching. What do you want them to know?" The blind man thought about it. "Tell them that we all go through darkness. Every single one of us. Different kinds, different reasons, but we all face our own night. And tell them that darkness doesn't mean the end. Sometimes it just means we're between chapters. The next one might be different, might be scary, but it's still worth reading." More applause erupted. The crowd couldn't help themselves. A little boy, the same one who'd pointed at him earlier, wiggled free from his mother and ran to the piano. He looked up at the blind man with wide, innocent eyes. "Mister, can I learn to play like you?" The blind man laughed, a real laugh full of warmth. "Do you have a piano at home?" "No, sir." "Then we'll start here," the blind man said. "This piano belongs to everyone. Come find me tomorrow. Same time. I'll show you some notes." The mother stood behind her son, crying, mouthing "thank you" over and over. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly. People didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay in this moment, this feeling, this reminder of what humans could do when they refused to give up. But life was calling them back. Jobs, responsibilities, the regular world. But they were different now. Every single one of them had been changed by what they'd witnessed. The businessman went back to his office and quit his job that afternoon. Started pursuing the art career he'd abandoned 20 years ago. The teenage boy deleted all his cruel social media posts and volunteered. At the community center that weekend, the nurse went back to the hospital and held her next patient's hand a little longer, cried with them a little more freely. The street musician kept playing her guitar, but now with new purpose, new understanding of what music could mean to people. The blind man sat at the piano a while longer, his fingers resting gently on the keys. The volunteer who'd helped him sat beside him on the bench. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, without someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." They sat together in comfortable silence as the square returned to normal around them. The cars started moving again. The shops reopened. Life resumed its usual pace, but nothing was really normal anymore. The city had laughed at the blind man. The city had judged him, dismissed him, mocked him, and then the city had learned the most important lesson of all: that you should never underestimate the human spirit. That tragedy can become triumph. That darkness can birth the most beautiful light. That sometimes the people we overlook are the ones with the most to teach us. The blind man picked up his cane, stood slowly, and walked away from the piano. Behind him, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, flooding the square with golden light. And somewhere in the distance, someone began to play the melody he'd created, passing it forward, keeping the music alive.